Sex education is important for everyone, but because society thinks that it's improper for women to talk about that, they miss out the opportunity to actually understand their body and own their body.
The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development is grounded in respect for human rights and the power of people to change the world. Every individual on the planet has the right to health and well-being in all aspects of their sexuality, their body, and their reproductive choices. Ensuring these rights is integral to addressing poverty, education, violence against women, and gender equality. Sexual and reproductive health rights are agreed in international law. They were fought for by courageous women's rights activists and advocates across a broad range of professional fields and frontline experiences by movements of all ages, levels, and backgrounds. They are still being fought for. While progress has been made globally, many barriers remain, especially for those most marginalized, excluded, or discriminated against. Human rights are central to delivering the 17 Sustainable Development Goals in the Sustainable Development Agenda. Indeed, each SDG target is simultaneously a metric and a claim for human rights. The interplay between these political commitments and human rights obligations is particularly important when it comes to achieving sexual and reproductive health rights. For decades, human rights-based tactics have been used to drive progress. In this episode of Right to a Better World, experts share challenges they have faced and tactics they have used to address them. The challenges they describe occur in settings all around the world. The strategies used are ones that they have found to be successful in their own settings. Viewers are encouraged to learn from these experiences and consider how tactics could be adapted to their own contexts. When sexual and reproductive health begins with equality, the discussions, decisions, programs, and policies which follow can build towards a future where every individual is not only born free, but lives free and equal in dignity and rights without violence or discrimination. The time to take action is now.
If a girl doesn't access information about bodily autonomy and all, how will she make choices about her life?
Comprehensive Sexuality Education, or CSE, is a curriculum-based process of teaching and learning about the cognitive, emotional, physical, and social aspects of sexuality. It aims to equip children and young people, girls, boys, and individuals of all gender identities, with knowledge, skills, attitudes, and values that will empower them to realize their health, well-being, and dignity, develop respectful social and sexual relationships, consider how their choices affect their own well-being and that of others, and understand and ensure the protection of their rights throughout their lives. CSE has a direct impact on the ability of children and young people to realize a wide diversity of rights, including protection from violence, ultimately empowering them to lead healthy, safe, and productive lives. It is a fundamental part of the SDG commitment to educate children for sustainable lifestyles, human rights, and gender equality. But too many young people still make the transition to adulthood without access to age-appropriate CSE. Many people still hold erroneous beliefs about the purpose, content, and effects of teaching young people about sexuality and sexual and reproductive health. For instance, that it encourages early sexual activity, or that it is used as a tool to control population growth. These attitudes hinder the translation of laws and policies and plans and strategies into action.
Some of these issues that are important for young people are often left unspoken as they challenge cultural beliefs about young women being able to take responsible decisions about their health and about their future. Particularly, access to comprehensive sexuality educations as well as discussions about sexual pleasure are still challenging.
CSE helps young people to develop knowledge, skills, attitudes, and values to make informed decisions about their sexual and reproductive health and well-being, and to respect human rights and gender equality. Research has shown that curriculum-based CSE programs can contribute to delayed initiation and decreased frequency of sexual intercourse, decreased number of sexual partners, reduced risk-taking, and increased use of condoms and contraception.
We have a huge problem on adolescent pregnancy, not only in Brazil but in the whole Latin America. HIV infections rates are growing. That's a concrete consequence if you take out sexual education from school. We are making everything harder.
We have a very strong NGO network working in sexuality education and also sexual health, which has been a very important force in supporting sexuality education and providing the kind of arguments that make it clear that CSE is not only part of the quality education that we all want, but also an activity that helps young people, particularly children and young people, to have much better lives.
CSE sits at the crossroads where education, health, and human rights meet. It is central to the achievement of the SDGs' aim to leave no one behind and realise human rights and gender equality for all.
In about 2006, the government came out clearly and said there's no more sexuality education in schools. So our organization filed a case challenging the ban, but we had to change the approach by marrying sexuality education to other rights. The sitting judge was baffled. She was telling us, but you guys, why would you come to court over such a matter? Sexuality education, isn't it taught in your homes? And then there's this propaganda of LGBTI rights, there's teaching children same-sex marriages, early masturbation. Don't you think you're actually just worsening this situation? When we started talking about the right of education, health, how they're endangering girls and all, she started opening up. And for us, we felt like we were starting to penetrate that space of where someone is trying to see it where we're coming from and not just being radical about it. Gather evidence and link it to the Sustainable Development Goals, but don't sound complex. Link it to issues like the right to education, the right to health.
In the last 10 years, an increasing number of countries have put in place national policies and strategies on sexuality education. But overall, political commitment to implementing CSE remains weak.
Sexuality education has not been permitted by the government because it's meant to have a polluting influence on young minds. So they're taught abstinence, they're taught about population being a problem, but they're not actually given information about ways to use protection during sex.
International human rights frameworks and commitments can be used as advocacy tools to encourage governments to uphold human rights obligations, as well as commitments under the SDG agenda.
Goal number 4 means that young girls and women should access information. It's a right that the government has to ensure that it brings into place by 2030. We have a very progressive constitution, but very few people are educated about it. We get great policies and laws and they're put on shelves, so you don't find them being enacted. We would like to actually traverse every county. We have 47 counties in Kenya and actually do scorecards and check, is this up to standard, is it up to par? And hopefully have people who understand what comprehensive sexuality education is and shift the stigma around such conversations.
Growing and sustaining political commitment to CSE requires identifying champions and allies across sectors, including health, education, and other domains, and building shared ownership and commitment.
Another thing that we've done is really try to develop ownership within schools. So rather than just presenting them with the content, we work with them to identify the needs. We train administrators and decision makers, not just the teachers. And we work very closely with the parent community to identify what their needs are and what their concerns are. With regards to the government, I think we've taken a very similar approach, which is to try and develop ownership within the government itself, to have champions that we have worked with and sensitized within the government who can take ownership of this and really figure out how it can best work in public schools.
Supportive laws, policies, and strategies are fundamental for CSE to be scaled up and sustained. This requires long-term advocacy with key stakeholders working towards the same goals.
We have been able to harness approval and the support from political groups and also from community groups, and very especially from our local NGOs. My message is that we need to consult all important stakeholders when starting a program and also while implementing it.
Legislation can be a valuable tactic, where and when appropriate, to ensure the implementation of supportive laws, policies, and strategies on CSE.
The law says that the Department of Education should have an age and developmentally appropriate sexuality education curriculum. It was important to have this law so that we had something on which we can say that, you know, the state didn't do it, to hold the state accountable.
Despite increasing recognition of the need for CSE, evidence of its effectiveness, availability of tools to plan, monitor, and evaluate CSE programs, and inclusion of CSE in international declarations and regional commitments, resistance and backlash to CSE persist in many countries around the world. A variety of approaches can be used to proactively build support for CSE, anticipate resistance, and respond effectively to backlash if and when it occurs.
The church in Poland is playing a very strong informal role and has a big impact on decision makers, despite the fact that the majority of the society supports sexuality education at schools. Subsequent governments for last 20 years or so were unwilling in implementing sexuality education programs which will provide modern standards. The reality is that very few of young people are getting good sexuality education in schools.
What happened right after the law was passed was that a case was brought in the Supreme Court questioning the constitutionality of this law. We are burdened by having to defend every step of the way. Uphold the Irish law. It's like fighting a battle with one arm behind your back because you're fighting in court at the same time trying to implement the law. So that's our difficulty.
Parents and communities may oppose CSE for a variety of reasons. They may refuse to acknowledge that young people are sexual beings, or they may truly believe that young people do not need sexuality education. On the other hand, they may know that sexuality education is important, but be embarrassed or uncomfortable supporting it, or they may want to educate their children about sexuality themselves to ensure that it aligns with their beliefs and values. Building knowledge and understanding of the value of CSE among parents and families from the outset and being transparent and inclusive in the development of curricula is critical for proactively building support for CSE.
I think one important lesson is that we can't do it alone. We have to work with the women of the community, the men of the community. It can't be just academics, lawyers and doctors, because if the community don't see how it's going to affect them, then it's not going to work either.
Over the last 20 years, we have tried and tested a number of models, a number of methodologies to bring people on board, to approve and accept and develop ownership of comprehensive sexuality education programs. We are very transparent with the content, and if there are concerns, we try to address those before the programs ever begin so that we face less resistance later on. We've tried to really make the content local. For example, we don't even use comprehensive sexuality education as terminology. We use life skills-based education. That immediately puts people at ease, and they can move beyond thinking that this is just about discussing sex or sex education. We have also had all of our content reviewed by local technical review committees, and these have been comprised of parents, teachers, administrators, students themselves, even religious leaders. And in that way, we've developed a lot of parent champions who have supported us and helped us with the programs in communities and having communities accept those programs.
In order to build support for CSE, it is important to understand the concerns and sensitivities of the community. Building consensus and a shared understanding among different stakeholders, including children and adolescents themselves, is crucial for anticipating how and why resistance might arise and effectively responding when it does.
Can we meet together and we all put our views on this table, whether you agree or not, and then we find a middle ground? And it's been working. And as I talk right now, next week, we'll be having a 2-day residential where we have stakeholders from Ministry of Education, Gender, Health, CSOs, our partners. We'll be having live stories from the very voices that are affected by these issues, because most of the times we make choices for the youth, the adults, but we don't hear it from their perspective or their point of view. We just go to the fields and collect literature or stories. But these voices actually paint the picture that so many of us can resonate with in trying to fight for these rights.
There are now 1.8 billion young people in the world, more than at any other time in history. Providing young people with equal access to CSE respects their right to the highest attainable standard of health, including safe, responsible, and respectful sexual and reproductive choices, free of coercion and violence. It contributes to building knowledge and understanding, positive attitudes and values, and gender equality.
We've been very careful to ensure that the content is consistently framed within rights. We have found ways to communicate with people about the importance and the rights of young people to have access to this information for their health, for their safety, for their well-being, for their happiness.
This approach is more than theoretical. Human rights-based tactics can offer a practical route to addressing challenges such as misconceptions and misinformation, weak political commitment and implementation, and resistance and backlash to CSE programs. By demonstrating need and effectiveness, grounding the case in health and human rights, advocating through international human rights frameworks, building champions and allies across sectors, advocating for supportive laws, policies, and strategies, engaging parents, families, and communities, identifying and addressing concerns and sensitivities. Every individual can help to deliver the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, building support and understanding of every young person's right to education, health, and well-being in an inclusive and gender-equal society.